A common question I seem to get within the ethnic nationalist scene is, are you actually white? You seem to talk a lot about ethnic nationalism, but as an American, I bet you're actually just a 56%er LARPing as an Aryan. And, well, I understand that, people like the Purity Spiral and all this shit, but I thought I'd go ahead and answer that question today in this video while I have the time. And if you'll excuse me, I'm still a bit sick. I'm not back up into shape just yet. But anyway, here we go. So let's take a look at this image here. I just pulled this off of my Ancestry page. Obviously, I blacked out all my personal info. But as you can see, this is the genetic test that I did, and then I'll go over the family tree and kind of explain where exactly these genes come from. So, I did this test maybe a couple months ago, and before that, I spent about 6 months to a year putting together as complete of a family tree as I possibly could with sources for each one so that I know that it's all legit. So what I found is pretty much exactly what the genetic test told me. So you can see the sort of yellow area is about 73% Europe West, and it's a divide between what you would consider English people and Germans. There's a lot of English people and a lot of Germans in the family tree. The next highest proportion is Ireland, Scotland, Wales. My dad's side is almost 100% Scottish or Welsh, and then I have a couple of Irish ancestors on my mother's side, but that's where that comes from. And then the rest of the stuff, sort of these low confidence regions, you can't put too much into this, but Europe South, I have at least one or two Italian ancestors that mixed into the family back in like the 1700s. The Great Britain portion is interesting because I think this is referring to the native Britons before the Anglo-Saxon invasion, so pretty low on the actual Britain count. And then Scandinavia was interesting. I wasn't expecting this, but as the further back I go, the closer I get to Scandinavia. So I did manage to find a couple of Norwegian ancestors very, very long time ago, almost 1,000 years ago. That was the oldest I could find records for. And then the less than 1% Middle East, I'm going to go ahead and chalk that up to Jewish tricks. Just saying. I don't know where that's from. I couldn't find any reference to it in any history. And plus, I mean, it's less than 1%. It doesn't even give you a specific amount, so who fucking knows where that's from. No African, no Native American, nothing like that, which, big surprise there, I guess. So based just on this, I mean, what do y'all think? Is this a Meramut tier? Is this literally 56%, or does this mean I'm some Aryan super soldier? I don't know. And interesting enough, if you look actually on the map of America, it shows typical migration, what I would call genetic clusters. And yeah, it pretty much lines up exactly where my family landed when they came here. So going into more of the family tree, my mother's side is much more well documented because the English were very good at keeping records for like families. There's a couple books that happen to go into sort of some parts of my family history way back in the day, and most of that part of the family was English land gentry, sort of the upper classes or whatever. And eventually some of them got pissed off and eventually bought a boat and then came over about 430 some odd years ago, and then settled in the Tennessee region, and eventually they wound up in the Midwest. Same thing with the German side. All of the German side ended up moving to America in the mid-19th century region, and they also moved to the Midwest, and eventually they linked up, and well, there you go. And there's a couple little offshoots in there every now and again. I think on my mother's side, there's like someone who was Swiss and someone who was actually French. I think they got together and they mixed into the German side, and then that couple ended up coming to America. So I think that's where the Italian comes from. But for the most part, the English side had always been English gentry before they moved to the colonies in America, and then the German side actually goes as far back as the Holy Roman Empire, as far as I could find actual records. And a couple of the male figures in the German side fought for the Holy Roman Empire, and then when they finished their military career, some interesting stories in there, but finished their military career, settled down in the Rhineland and stayed there for about 200 years before eventually getting forced out by the French Catholics, and then they migrated to America. A pretty interesting story. But here's something I found particularly interesting about this genetic test is this something called genetic diversity. So if you kind of zoom in on the regions that you can look at in these genetic tests, it'll show you a comparison of you and a typical native of that region. So in this one in particular, if we look at the Europe West portion, it shows how I compare to the typical person native to the Europe West region. And I'm at like 73%, and according to this, typical natives around 48%. So, I mean, take that as you will, but I found that pretty funny. Compare this to the Scottish, Welsh, Irish part, and it's like natives are like 95%, and I'm nowhere near that, which is pretty funny. But I thought that was interesting what these genetic testing companies are doing. And really, I mean, this service was only about $100, which isn't too bad. I know people always complain about, oh, don't give your DNA up to these companies. They're working for the Zog or whatever. And it's like, for me, I think it's more important to really nail down the science behind where exactly my genes come from. It's an interesting thing. You really get to sit down and find out what group you belong to. You know, it's a part of your inherent identity, which is a part of human nature. But if you haven't done a test like this, even if you've got the paperwork to back up where your family comes from, take one of these tests and see, you know, where exactly it places you. I mean, who knows if it's really true, but this seems to hold true based on all the records I found, so I think it was worth it. And it was a lot of fun really connecting with people of the past. Because, you know, for me, when I used to think about the past, I never really put a face to it. But when I went through this 1 year period where I was doing this kind of family tree and I was looking, oh, this person was alive during the Napoleonic Wars. And it's like, wow, I never really realized that I had family members or ancestors, whatever you want to call them, who were alive and experienced it back in the day. It's like, oh, that's kind of cool. You sort of put a name and a face, like a real physical person that existed to that time period. And you wonder what their life was like. And on the couple of chances that I got to read about their lives is very interesting. You get a real connection to the past. And this is the important part, I think, about this, is that you get a connection to people who are no longer around. Obviously, these are the people who set up civilization, who have passed along a lot to us. It's sort of this handing of the torch kind of scenario. It's like, hey, we sacrificed and slaved and worked our asses off to get where we got. I'm handing you the torch. Now it's your turn. What are you going to do with it? And before this, I never really thought about it. Like, I never really could put a name or face to historical events, but now I have a deeper connection to people who existed before me, and I think that's relatively important to this kind of movement. So if you haven't done at least a family tree, you don't have to pay for a fancy service like this to do record keeping. You can go out right now, find the oldest person in your family that's still coherent, sit them down and get names and dates and birthdays and whatever stories they have about your family. Because eventually, you are going to be the oldest person alive in your family. And eventually, you're going to be the only person who's going to be able to remember this stuff. So if you don't write it down now, if you don't get that information out of your the oldest parts of your family, it's gone forever. And you'll never get that back. And it's a real shame when things like that disappear. The only thing you need to get started with the family tree on Ancestry, which is the service that I use, is you need at least 4, maybe 5 generations worth of information. So first name, last name, date of birth, date of death, and place of residence, and then maybe like a life event. If you can get that for 5 generations, which wasn't hard for me, if you can get that, you can start the family tree, and then Ancestry's little leaf service that pops up will allow you to click on it, and it will show you matches that have already been made, and you can verify and then add the documents to your collection. It's a really nice service. A bit pricey, but I think it was worth it to be able to compile all of this information. I mean, it's a massive family tree for me because so many of these documents have been preserved over long periods of time. And I'll tell you this right now. Over this year-long period that I went, I was able to go all the way back to the 9th century with a pretty good reliability, pretty high probability that this stuff was all true and that these people were legit. So very interesting. I mean, you never would think that, oh, hey, I've got a connection to 1,000 years ago. I can put a name and sometimes even a face to someone who lived 1,000 years ago. That's pretty fucking cool in my eyes. That being said, be proud of who you are and where you come from, and recognize the past and think about the future. Thanks for watching.